Alright, so I'm gonna tell you how I do a figure drawing sketch. Before we start, um, some of you might be wondering, why do we do figure drawings or sketches or gesture drawings? And there is a subtle difference between them, but I just want to group them together in a category for now, for simplicity. The reason we do them is to make poses less awkward, but also to truly understand the human form. So you can imagine, for example, if you were drawing a bike, if you have no idea how the bike works, you might miss out on important details. You might not draw the handlebars, they might be too big or not practical. And you draw them in a way that doesn't actually work. And anybody who knows how they work looks at it and will think, that doesn't quite look like a bike. But you wouldn't know exactly what's off, right? So this is like the same thing with people. You draw a person, and if you don't understand the gesture, the fundamental like anatomy and ways that the body works, and you draw a person, it will look awkward, but you wouldn't know why. This is particularly important because all of us viewers, we've seen people before, and we see people every day, and we're adapted to see and recognize people and to know what looks natural and what doesn't. So because we're so sensitive to people, like visually, if something looks off, it will look really off, right? Unlike something like clothing, right? If a shirt is folded in a slightly different way, it still looks like a shirt. But if a person were twisted or sitting or posing in an awkward way, you would recognize that. And I would go a step further and say this is particularly true for some parts of people. For example, faces. We're very sensitive to seeing slight changes in faces. If the eyes are slightly high or low, it looks like a completely different person because we're adapted to notice these things. So all this is to say, drawing, gesture drawing, figure drawing, these are fundamentals to help understand how people move and how proportions work, to make your drawings of people feel more natural. And when you master it, you can draw people from reference without having to. You can draw people not just from reference, but you can also draw them from your memory, from your mental library, and make them look natural. Okay. So I'm gonna start with a sketch. So this is my normal setup. I would have the left side of my screen be the reference, the right side of my screen is my drawing. Okay, and then I usually start with a thin brush. Okay, and with your canvas size, pick something that makes sense. For me, I just go with the default, but if you are drawing, say, a vertical drawing, you might want to have if you're drawing on paper, for example, you might want to lay out your paper vertically. If you want to draw a person horizontally, someone lying down, for example, you might want to use your paper horizontally. Now I'm just going to start with a square sheet because it's most flexible. I'm doing a variety of poses just for my quick sketches. And then, so on my right side of my screen, I have the canvas and the pen. Now for the pen size, this is an interesting discussion because a lot of people like to talk about what brushes they use, what textures they use, and then there are people who say brushes don't matter. Now I would say I'm somewhere in between. It depends on your purpose. If we are trying to master figure sketching, our goal is to understand how people move, how things work, and understand the structure. So to focus on understanding the structure, right, that is our focus. We're not trying to portray detailed rendering or anything. So I like to use a simple brush, very thin ink pen-like brush. This way, if we have something that's slightly off, not precise, right, and say I drew it here, you can tell that my drawing is slightly off. And that is important because then you can spot your mistakes. Here's what not to do. What not to do is to use a very thick brush. Then you can't spot your mistakes. And they're hidden in the brush thickness. If you wanted to, you could use a fancy like textured brush, right? Let me find something. This one has some texture, it's not too visible. Maybe if I lower the opacity, you can kind of see it has some texture. That doesn't really matter. I mean, you wouldn't see it if we're using thin brush anyway. But do not use like a blurry brush because you can't see where your line actually was. Like, if I use this brush, how do I know if my line was here, if my line was here, my line was here? Like, what was I actually drawing? Because we care about your understanding. You need to see if your understanding of the drawing is accurate or not. So you want something that can show you your mistakes. I also think chiseled brushes, they're okay, but they give you a bit of a shortcut because they have a natural like edge to them in a certain way that might make your drawing look more aesthetic than it actually than how accurate it is. So like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example of something, right? That's a leg, right? The way you see here, different color. This is, first of all, obviously this leg has some problems, like, what is going on with this? Like, why is the lower leg so thin, and why is there bump here? But because my brush was thick, that was one thing, and because the chiseled brush has a natural, like, tapering effect, it almost makes this part look kind of good, like shadow, right? And kind of hides how bad this actually is. So if I were to use the same, if I were to trace it over with a completely different thin brush, I'm just trying to roughly trace the middle of my line and hide, oops. I meant to do this on another layer so you can see. Here. So if I trace it over like this, now you can see how bad it is. But with this brush, it doesn't look as bad. And remember, I'm only suggesting this because we're trying to practice your understanding and how precisely you capture things. If you want to practice line weight, if you want to practice line art, that's a totally different story. And that is why I say for brushes, pick what suits your needs. If your focus is on structure, pick a brush that shows you your flaws. Okay. So now I'm going to start sketching. Usually, I like this website, sketchdaily.net. You can have do a drill with 30-second timer, and it would switch between different poses. You can also skip poses if you think it's not very suitable for your study, which I might do during this study if I feel like the pose doesn't, showcase a pose well enough, or like the shape doesn't really isn't something I need to feel like I need to practice, so I might skip them. So now I do want to mention, this is a lot of prelude before starting, but these are all very important because if you set the right direction when you practice, then your practice is compounding. It's very effective and it will really improve your art. If you practice just anything, right, if you don't set the right direction, you just pick whatever, you may be practicing like not intentionally enough, or you think you're intentional, but it's actually not helping you. So I want to make sure that whoever's watching this is practicing in a way that helps you improve the quickest. And this is why I like doing 30-second drills. The idea is I will pull drawings, show it for only 30 seconds, and during those 30 seconds, capture as much as I can. Then I would switch onto the next drawing, the next reference image. And I'm drawing from reference image of photos because photos capture what real humans look like. All cartoons, other styles, they are derived from our understanding of reality. So in a way, some other artist has looked at reality, captured it in their head mentally, digested and outputted a simplified version. So that's why when we study, I like to go to the source. I like to study from real life. You could also study digested versions, like drawing from anime. That would also help in a different way because that shows you how the other artist has interpreted reality. For example, some artists like to break down the body into cubes, while others like to break down the body into spheres, right? But studying both can and would help you, and I do encourage that. But for me personally, I just like to go to the source because I believe that all other cartoonified drawings are derived from the source, which is real life photos and images of people. Okay, so and then when you're studying for poses, I recommend the 30-second drill. Okay, I'll tell you why I recommend the 30-second drill, and I'll tell you why I recommend dynamic poses for the reference. The 30-second drill is great because you have to capture as much as you can in a short amount of time. So that forces you to look at the big picture and not get bogged down on details. It also forces you to build up your mental library at a fast pace because every 30 seconds you're looking at a new picture. If instead you had to finalize, detail, and render one single image, you are only practicing the figure sketching portion of it once. You're only studying the structure of one person. The rest of it is rendering. It's a totally different skill. The rest of it may be line art, maybe detailing, right? If we want to focus on one skill, then repeat that single skill again and again. And that is why I want to do a 30-second gesture drawing skill practice drill. Now, as for dynamic poses, the reason for choosing dynamic poses is because when you're starting out, you need to understand how the body moves, how the rib cage and pelvis twist. And the best way to understand that is through movement. If you're looking at static, standing, or stiff poses, then you're just drawing very, not only does it look boring, but also it doesn't help you understand how the limbs move or the body parts interact and move. That is why I recommend more dynamic movement. And also later when you go to design your own drawings, dynamic moving people are generally just more captivating to look at. Like it's easier to design around that. But I think the main reason is you gain a better understanding of movement and body when you draw from moving people rather than static. When I say static, I mean more like, standing still, arms straight, legs straight, or like very basic rigid pose. Cool. So let's get started. I'm gonna stop the recording and restart another one.